Along with some pretty basic stuff like constants and enumerations and conditional statements and operators and expressions, loops are one of the most basic building blocks of any kind of programming language. Loops are essentially blocks of code that execute over and over again. And there's two different basic kinds of loops. There are loops that execute while a condition is met, and there are loops that execute a set number of times. So for example, you might have a loop that's running some piece of code for as long as a certain condition is true, like the user has not logged out, or the end of a file has not yet been reached, or something like that. You might also have a loop that runs a set number of times, the number of people attending a concert, or something like that. The way that you write loops is by using a couple of different constructs. For loops that execute while a condition is met, you have a while loop. And the while loop is written as you see it there. You have the keyword while, and then inside some parentheses, you have a condition that is true. And then inside the curly braces, you've got some code that's going to execute as long as that condition is true. There's also a close cousin of the while loop, which is the do while loop. And in this case, the while goes at the bottom of the loop instead of the top. And the main difference here is that the while loop is only going to execute when that condition is met. If that condition test is not met, nothing inside the while loop is going to run, and that condition is evaluated before the while loop ever even gets a chance to run. The do while loop is a little bit different. The code that is inside that loop is going to execute at least one time. And that's because it executes once, then the while is executed at the end of the loop to see if things should keep going. So in the case where you want to have a loop that runs only while a condition is met and no other times, use the while loop. If you have a condition where you want to execute some code just one time and then check to see if you should keep going, that's the do while loop. For the set number of times case, there's the for loop. And the for loop executes a given number of times, and it runs the code that's inside the curly braces. A close relative of the for loop is the for each loop, but we're not going to cover that one in this particular movie because it has to do with something called enumeration, and we'll look at it a little bit later in the course. For now, we're going to concentrate on the while, do while, and for loops. Let's take a look at the code to see how this works. I've got my example here open. This is my loops project, and over in my snippets, I've got my code, and I'm scrolled down to the loops section. So let's take a look at how the basic while loop works. So I'm going to copy these lines of code here. Copy that. And I'm going to paste it into my main. So I've got here an integer variable named myval, and we have a basic while loop. We're first going to write out a string of text that says basic while loop. And then you see here, here's the while definition. So while myval is less than 20, we're going to write myval is currently, and we're going to use the console's writeLine method with some string formatting here to write out what the current value of myval is. As always with loops, you want to make sure that the loop has some way to exit, otherwise you'll end up with what's known as an infinite loop. An infinite loop is a loop of code that just keeps going and going and going and going and never has any way to get out of it. So you want to make sure that you've got some code inside your loop such that at some point this condition up here is going to become false, and therefore your loop can terminate and your program can continue on its merry way. So what we're doing here is at the bottom of this loop, we're taking myval and we're adding 3 to it each time. And recall that the plus equals notation there means myval equals myval plus 3. So when myval becomes greater than 20, that condition will no longer be true up there in the while loop, and the loop should stop. So let's save this, and we're going to go ahead and run it. And you can see that the string gets written out, basic while loop, and myval is 15, and then we add 3, so myval is currently 18, and then we add 3, and myval becomes 21. So when the code executes and goes back to the top of the loop, that test is no longer true, and the loop stops. So right here. So the code executes in this line from top to bottom. The last statement is the myval plus equals 3 right here. When that executes, that gets this curly brace, we go back up to the top of the loop, and then this condition gets tested, and it fails the test. And that's what terminates the loop. Okay, let's take a look at another example. In this case, we're going to look at the do while loop. And I'm going to copy these lines of code right here. Okay, let's get rid of this one. And paste. In this case, we have a do while loop. And remember that in the case of the do while loop, the code inside the braces gets executed once before this condition gets met. So in this case, we have pretty much the same code. We're writing out the console.writeLine value that we're adding 3 each time. But let's see what happens. So this time we're going to save and we're going to run it. You can see here that the do while loop, my val is currently 15, my val is currently 18, and then we add 3, and then my val is 21, and the condition no longer is true, and therefore the loop executes right here. So right here, when we add the my val plus equals 3, this is no longer running. But let's watch what happens when I set this up at 20 to begin with. I'm going to save it. I'm going to run it. And you see, even though my val is not less than 20, it still goes through the loop at least one time. So that code is going to get executed once before the while condition has a chance to be evaluated. So even though the condition is false, the code got executed one time. So that's the do while loop. Let's take a look at our friend, the for loop. Here's the code for the for loop right here. And we're going to copy that. And we're going to paste it. A for loop is set up using 3 compact statements within the for statement itself. So here's the for right here. And then the first statement is the initialization of the counter variable. And in fact, I could expand that out and do something like this, where I say int I, and then I wouldn't need to do this here. I would simply say for I is equal to 0. What I was doing there was just concatenating one with the other. So this is the initialization or setup of the counter variable. Then we have the test to see if I is less than my val. This is the condition that gets evaluated each time. And then this is the statement that gets evaluated when the loop is complete. So this is setup, this is the condition, and then this is what happens each time through the loop. So I is going to start out as 0. We're going to test to see if it's less than my val, which is 20 right here. And we're going to add 5 each time. And each time through the loop, we're going to write out I is currently whatever its value is. So we're going to save, and we run it. And you can see that I starts out as 0, then it's 5, then it's 10, then it's 15, and then it gets to be 20, and that condition no longer needs to be true. See, 20 is not less than 20. If we change this to be less than or equal to, then 20 will actually match the condition. So if we run it again, you'll see that in this case, I is less than or equal to my val, because 20 matches the less than or equal to part of the condition. So that's the for loop, and that's how you get a loop to execute a certain number of times. Let's take a look at some other keywords we can use with loops. There are 2 special keywords that can be used with loops. There's the break keyword, which breaks out of the loop at the current point, regardless of whether the test condition has been met or not. And there's the continue keyword, which basically says, hey, skip the rest of the code in the loop, and then just jump back to the top of the loop code as if you had it completed one of the loops. So let's take a look at how these work. So I'm going to erase the code from my previous example, and we're going to go back to the snippets, and I'm going to copy over the last part of the example right here. Copy, and we're going to paste. So in this case, we're going to use the continue and break keywords. So here I have a for loop that's starting off at 0, and it's going to run until I is less than 10, and we're going to increment I by 1 each time. We're using the postfix increment operator here. Now there's 2 special conditions in here. When I is equal to 5, I'm going to use the continue keyword. Continue basically says, hey, skip everything from here on down, go down to the last brace, and then go back to the top again and execute whatever the third statement over here is, this part of the increment loop right here. And then in the case where I is equal to 9, I'm going to use the break keyword, which basically means, hey, you know what? Just stop the loop. It doesn't really matter where we are. It doesn't matter about the condition test up here. Just stop. So let's save, and we'll run it. Let's take a look at the output. So you can see that I starts off as 0, then it goes to 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. But remember, for the 5 case, we used the continue keyword. So we skipped over the line of code that said console.writeLine, so that line of code never got executed. The loop just continued as if it had run, but it skipped past all of the logic that I put where the continue keyword was. And then we continue incrementing, so I is now 6, then 7, and then 8. And then remember, when we got to the 9 case, we used the break keyword, which stops the loop in its tracks, as if the condition had failed. So let's go back to the code. And let's take this statement out. I'm going to comment this out and run it again. And you can see in this case, the loop does make it to 9. And then the value of I becomes 10, which is where it triggers the condition. And the condition is no longer met, and the loop stops. So if we go back to the code and we uncomment this, put the code back in. If I change this to, say, 7 and save and then run, you'll see that in this case, the loop only makes it as far as 6. Because as soon as I gets to be 7, we're calling the break command, which stops the loop. Loops are a very powerful part of programming, and you can see that C# loops are pretty versatile and pretty powerful in their own right.